is an interview-based podcast connecting listeners with musicians, writers, producers, etc. through curated playlists. This is Next in the Queue.
Right, and this is Next in the Queue, and I'm joined with the band Dummy. If y'all want to introduce yourselves.
Joe.
Hey, I'm Alex.
And can you also tell us what you do in the band as well?
I play guitar, or Joe. I play guitar.
Sorry.
It's all good. Guitar, synth, some bass.
I play drums and synth, and we both kind of like produce and do a lot of like recording stuff here at our house.
Awesome. So you've stated in the past that you like to flesh things out live before releasing something. With the last half of the album, like in 2021, you had to create some of that during COVID, so you weren't allowed that element. Do you think that's still true, or have you kind of shifted from that, or do you still like to flesh things out live?
I think it's kind of COVID, because we wrote basically, I guess, probably 80% of that record during lockdown. It just taught us a new way to kind of write and compose songs at home, and using kind of Ableton to shape songs more. And that continued with the Sub Pop single, and then into the Free Energy stuff, where we did a little bit of live, I guess, playing songs live, and then some of it is
It's a mix.
Yeah, it's a mix.
And I think it was a mix on the first album too. Like, we did end up like definitely evolving everything once we were at the studio. But we had kind of played a few of the songs before the pandemic started. We'd only played a couple of shows, but this time we were able to play more shows, like play our new songs definitely more times, and we had like all these different versions that we went through over the course of like a couple months. But then, yeah, definitely same thing happened when we got to the studio. We just evolved everything further, and there end up being like new tracks that just rose out of sort of being at the studio. And so, yeah, it's kind of a mix. It's definitely a mix.
Yeah. And like the song Dip in the Lake has had like 3 different versions of it. The original demo version, then the live version we played when we did a tour with Fax, and then the kind of final version you hear on the record, which was a reaction to the way it felt playing it live. We kind of like evolved it. We pushed it further from where it started, and it ended up starting off being more kind of like a droney Velvet Underground sounding song, and then it morphed into the kind of more minimalist composer meets cluster kind of song that it is now.
Are there any other songs on the album that kind of went through that process as well?
Blue Dada started off as like a demo that was just the second half of the song, and then it was Alex's idea to do the whole beginning part that's more of like the kind of
but we had a few different versions of that where like we kind of weren't exactly sure how to
evolve it.
It took a few like versions of kind of practicing it, playing the show, kind of thinking of a new idea or whatever, and then kind of like applying that before we were like landed where I think the song,
the arrangement is now. Yeah. And then Soonish, I think, was the only other song we played live, but that song is probably the only song on the record that came together.
That one was
quickly.
More simple in that sense, where but at the same time it did kind of like change, and like little elements kind of shifted to kind of it just playing it live definitely has that kind of effect where you realize things. You have like a very, I guess, clarity on things when you're like performing.
Yeah, you can tell if it's working in two different ways. You can feel it just in yourself. You're like, okay, this feels exciting. Or you can kind of feel the excitement that you're feeling and then feel the audience's kind of like reception, whether that's like, it's not necessarily like maybe a physical response, but just kind of like in the room, you can kind of just feel things flattening out or feeling exciting. And I think, that's kind of how we settle on certain things if we're playing them live, and then the way they turn into recordings.
Are there any songs off the record that you didn't get a chance to play live that you're excited to do on this tour that you guys have coming up?
Yeah, I mean, the rest of the record, basically, it's like we've just been really
that's what we've been doing recently, is just kind of teaching ourselves the new songs that are on the album, because there's a handful that
never played live, or we kind of still have to like adapt to them because they're so they're so like DAW, like Ableton sort of centric, where we have to like figure out a way to somehow convey. We reverse engineer them kind of like from songs from Mandatory Enjoyment. Live are always a lot heavier than the way they sound on the recording. Like Final Weapon on the recording is kind of, it's propulsive, but it's definitely mellow in its way. And then live, it's a much more like punk kind of aggressive song, because a lot of the like some of the layers get stripped back and it becomes more of just like.
But in general, we really like to like sort of adapt the songs. Like I think we just embrace the idea that they'll change more as we like go on tour and play them, and kind of like realize little moments or change little things or whatever. Like
just the kind of like improv nature of, even if in a song where like on the recording there wasn't a pregnant pause, maybe live there is a pregnant pause where we let it kind of sit in the air a little longer before we kind of like snap back in, and just stuff like that. And just live, we just try to approach things as like, I guess, pragmatically as we can.
Well, we like to do everything live. Like we don't use like any
backing tracks or computers or anything like that. We do everything
all like live instrument performance, based. Yeah. So it can be hard to like make everything come together when we just been working on on a computer for so long. But yeah.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting to see. Do you have like what are some of like the equipment that you're going to be using for the live set?
It's mostly the same stuff we have been using. I got a new keyboard. It's like a Arturia, like their new version of in their Freak series. Like I used this one for many years on tour. Just like right beside the drum kit, I would have it set up. The Micro Freak, which is like just a tiny little, very lightweight synth. And I got really obsessed with that thing. So when they released the new one, I was really, really excited to like mess around with it. So now we have that going, and now Joe is using my old Micro Freak. So now we have kind of like even more.
There's just one extra synth now.
One extra synth.
That's pretty much the only difference, is like there's one extra synth live, even though that seems to cause issues with sound people.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, and so Free Energy is your sophomore album following Mandatory Enjoyment. How do you think you've grown and changed since then?
It's been the biggest thing I would say was like our big year of touring in 2021. Like 2022, we were on the road for like
150 days.
So we ended up just,
pounding those songs into the dirt.
Our old album, and just kind of like playing shows in general. I think we wanted to like go like do something a little more exciting for the next project. So
and more physical.
Yeah. So I think when we were working on like the first album and everything before this, honestly, it was all kind of like natural. Like it all kind of flowed naturally and was like pretty, easy to come up with ideas. Like we kind of had like a bank of ideas from just so many years of listening to music and whatever, and it was just easy to like put things together. Whereas for this album, we just really struggled for a long time to like
get excited.
Yeah, like everything kind of felt too similar to what we had been doing, and we wanted to like figure out a new sort of avenue of sound or aesthetic or whatever for the new one. But
and also like putting not strict rules, but like rules on what we didn't want to repeat, which is we didn't use really any kind of like analog vintage synth stuff, and we wanted to make sure we avoided kind of the same rhythmic ideas that we had on previous recordings, and like explore just other facets of our taste that were more exciting to us now that we're kind of like, we've basically released like 2 full lengths in a sense with the 2 EPs and a single and then the first LP. So it almost feels like in a way we're on like our 3rd record. So like at this point for us, it was like really, we wanted to make sure we made like a change that felt exciting to us, that, we would enjoy playing live and like just enjoy being artists and musicians again, because after you tour that much, it just kind of wears you out, like psychologically, and then also just artistically. You just kind of get, you're stuck in the rhythm of like playing the songs, and just, we kind of eked out any kind of emotion left in those songs that even now it's like kind of when we try to play old songs, we're kind of just bleh. So it's funny seeing bands who've played the same songs for like 20, 30, 40 years. I'm like, how does it even feel like a song anymore, and not just like, parts that are kind of all.
Yeah, it's just like embedded in your brain in a way that you don't think about anymore.
Yeah, it's not emotional or cathartic, really.
Yeah.
And then like piggybacking off of that, you guys had to like scrap a bunch, like almost an album worth of songs that you previously worked on. How did it feel to like start from scratch and like kind of recover your sound?
Yeah, for sure. Like I think because it was pretty much only me writing these demos, making these demos, at first I was, definitely like, damn, no one is really feeling the kind of demos I'm sending out.
For context, like I feel like this all took place over the course of like a month, when right after we finished.
It was over the course of like 3 months.
3 months, maybe.
Yeah.
We just finished our tour, so like we were all really burnt out, but I think at that moment you also felt like really sort of focused on what was next. So your mind was already like coming up with sort of new ideas, and you were playing guitar a ton. But what ended up happening was like no one else like sort of had any like input or like it was basically all your kind of like ideas from like top to bottom. So there was, I think we end up getting inspired by it, but it was definitely like it didn't feel like the next thing for us. It felt like too similar to our earlier material.
Yeah. But at the same time, it was really important for me to kind of like expel all those lingering kind of ideas or desires to do that sound that we've already kind of, drove home. And so then it kind of like the tunnel vision of what I've always viewed Dummy as, just like we blew that up, and then it was just the world was a little more open instead of being very strict on the rules of the band. And so it's funny doing air quotes knowing this just be audio, but yeah, just and I think that just helped, everyone kind of like, all right, we know we don't want to do this again. Let's just leave all these ideas. They're on a phone, they're on like our demo phone, and they'll probably live there forever, but that's fine. I don't really care. Like I'm not so precious about stuff that I'm pretty like, if everyone's like, I'm just like, all right, move on. I'll throw something out probably quicker than anyway.
Was there anything that you were able to salvage that you reworked into something else, or?
Nope. There's no no
I don't-
chords or
I'm not
anything.
sure. I feel like there might be like some ideas.
I'm positive. There's nothing from it that like ended up being.
I mean, I think maybe not from those specific like set of songs, but like we had earlier tracks. We had other songs that we
Played
worked
live,
on
yeah.
and even played live that we didn't
That got
like
trashed.
record. We didn't
Yeah.
end up recording them for the album. So and those songs I think did end up like getting not reused, but like maybe just kind of influencing other songs or the influencing them to kind of like change into sort of a more hybridized version, if that makes sense.
And then what are some memorable things that you guys experimented with while recording this album?
We were messing around with a lot of like guitar, like experimental guitar techniques, I guess. Like we were doing a lot of EBO was a big thing. We have also done like bass, like EBO on electric bass was another thing that we messed around with a lot for the album.
A lot of sampling of like guitars and loops of the guitars and then chopping those up and then feedback manipulation and sampling. Just a lot of like replacing all the synth stuff that we had done in the past. That all kind of got replaced by guitar. And whether that was like a guitar drone or guitar loops or guitar samples, I think we just dug in more to like using guitar as like a sound generator and like a textural thing opposed to a melodic thing. And I think with a lot of like the songs on the record, the bass carries a lot of like the melodic chord changes, and then the guitar is just kind of like making sound. It's not necessarily carrying the melody throughout a lot of the songs.
But I would also say we were experimenting a lot with like drum machine. We weren't really sure initially like what the mix of like programmed drums and live drums would be, and I think we had a totally different like sort of conception of what our whole album would sound like initially. We were thinking it would be more lo-fi and like home recorded and stuff. So
and that went in our minds the opposite direction. It's a much bigger.
Yeah, but then I think when we were at the studio, we embraced like the danciness and the big sounds that like we were able to achieve. Like even though we didn't initially sort of we didn't conceive of the songs that way necessarily, but they definitely.
It's just what ended up happening naturally.
Yeah, and we definitely all like felt like it was definitely the way to go.
The direction to go. Yeah. I remember being like, I think a day or two after the studio, I'm like, I was definitely being kind of just saying, oh, wow, I feel like everything's sounding way more big and like, I don't know.
I mean, just from our first album where we were very particular about how we wanted everything to sound and wanted it to be very balanced and not overly like, explosive sounding or anything. Yeah.
Now that you've been living in LA for like a longer period of time, are there any bands currently in the scene that you think are doing really cool things?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our friends are really amazing artists. Modati is releasing their album's coming out very soon, right?
At the end of September. Yeah. They're a really great kind of lush inspired dream pop band. They're really great. I think there's the band I saw, SML. They're like a jazz 5-piece, kind of make abstract experimental jazz. They're really interesting, really great live, like exceptionally. When I saw them, I was blown away by how good they were.
We also have there's a lot of, I feel like, crossover between LA and the Bay Area with bands. And I feel like there's a lot of bands we really love up there too.
April Magazine, Aluminum.
Yeah.
Those bands. But the thing with LA is that it's kind of like this place that is a mixture of the big, mainstream world of music, industry. And then the DIY culture here is definitely lacking in a lot of ways because of just the way the music industry works here. And it pushes,
Well, it's just so centrally, I guess, it's so controlled centrally by like sort of larger forces compared to other cities, I guess.
Yeah.
To
There's
where,
just not as much DIY.
yeah, it's hard to find like a cheap space to have show in LA, I would say.
Yeah. Here,
shows aren't, I feel like
there's
not much.
They're far and few between here. And I feel like bands that we moved here not with the like idea of being in a band and like, trying to make it big in LA. We moved here and we knew we were going to play music, but like the ambition was just music ambition. It wasn't any other ambition. And I think we're maybe rare in that sense here that we weren't trying ever to like be a band that like,
I mean, it's definitely a city you move to like, do a career in music
or film or whatever. Yeah.
Like follow your dreams or whatever. So there's that whole lane of people, I feel like, but yeah, I don't know. We don't really have much.
There's not much of a scene here specifically, and we don't really feel like we're a part of any particular scene here. It feels weird to kind of not necessarily disparage the city you live in. Obviously, there's a lot of people who do things that they're excited and interested in. I think like the DIY stuff like in Oxnard, which is outside of LA, I think there's more like a DIY scene there and a lot more like in bands that are kind of swinging for the fences in a way, more so than bands that are doing it here. It seems like everyone wants to make it here. Yeah. And we don't really care about that. We're just making the music we like.
Yeah, I just talked with Chatterton. They're from Oxnard too.
Yep. I did PR for their record.
Awesome. I love that record that they just put out.
I love the way it's constructed. I love the way they like recorded and mixed it. It's just they're doing something very interesting with the sonics in there.
And we're playing a show with them in Oxnard.
The last date of our West Coast tour is with them in Oxnard.
Awesome. Do you think you see a lot more solo acts in LA that way then?
I think in general, like the whole industry is moving more towards solo acts, just purely, I think, based on the fact that like it's easier for people to like socially, I guess, parasocially, like engage with like a solo act versus like a band, which feels more like, I guess, ambiguous or anonymous in some way, or mysterious. I think that's something that's like not really a thing anymore. It's like mysterious aspects in bands. Like,
but I also think that it's as a solo act, you have complete and utter control.
Yeah, it's definitely also a dynamic shift to one person having control.
But it feels very much in line with like America, where it's like the individual auteur thing, which is like almost always bullshit anyway, because an auteur who makes a movie, they have a million different people working on the film usually to make the vision.
And there's together. Like an art to every aspect. There's an art to the lighting, art to sound. It's the same with music. Like, and I think with always a collaborative process.
Yeah. And I think with a band, that kind of like the push and pull of a band is, infinitely more interesting to me as a artist. And
I mean, our band specifically like has so much like different sort of tastes from just and like musical backgrounds. Like obviously you and Emma both have like so much like sort of extreme music background, metal and hardcore and everything. Yeah. And I was always way more into like electronic, ambient, like avant-garde music, whatever. So I feel like there's just,
and Nate's kind of like there's definitely true indie rock guy.
There's definitely just an interesting aspect to like the collaboration of like different people with different perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, if you listen to like, Sonic Youth and then you listen to their solo records sound so vastly different. And only Thurston Moore ever really is trying to capture the Sonic Youth thing. Yeah. And the rest of them kind of like just do their own thing. Or, with Steve Shelley, he's been in disappears and now's in Winged Wheel, and then Kim Gordon's been doing her like kind of, you know, the trap noise kind of mixture, and then Lee Ronaldo's definitely been in his Grateful Dead kind of sounding stuff. And I think, but like the reason that band sounds so great for the time that they were like, you know, really firing all cylinders is 4 different personalities coming together to make this, you know, one thing. And I think, you know, obviously there's, you know, some solo things that are undeniably great, but you know, I mean, it's not like, that's just, you know, how our band is. We ended up as a band. And I think that's interesting, but there's definitely. And I also think that, you know, with indie rock and like solo stuff, is that because of like the mainstreamification of indie rock in a lot of ways, you know, there is that focus on like, you know, mainstream pop, so much of it is about the solo artist. And I think that has seeped so far into independent music in general.
Well, I think the line is just totally blurred at this point, where is like indie rock versus pop, whatever. It's kind of,
there's things that are on major labels that are called indie rock or bedroom pop, and it's just like not, you know, it's not those things. It's, you know, it's a you know, part of a machine. So
yeah. And how do you think that y'all come together to collaborate?
I mean, it just changed. Every song is different. Some songs are, you know, a demo that I make that, you know, kind of just filters through everyone, and by the end it gets to a certain thing. And then, you know, other songs, like the last song on the record, is more just Alex kind of going off. And then, you know, Null Space started off as a demo that's just Nathan's voice and bass, and then we built around that to get it to where it was. And it's just, it's always different. It's just, and I think, you know, with Emma kind of keeps us grounded in a way because she's more about the immediacy of songs. And then Alex and I can definitely sometimes want to kind of go off in a more far out place, but then, you know, they'll pull us kind of back to like, you know, so it feels immediate. It feels like it's impactful opposed to like, you know, kind of getting lost in the experimental sauce or whatever.
And for this album, we've already talked about it a bit. You wanted to really change up your sound. How do you, I mean, 9 Inch Nails is kind of reminiscent of your old sound a little bit more, has more pop elements to it. Do you think that was like a goodbye to your old sound, or just something that y'all still wanted to include?
I don't know. That's an interesting question. Because I don't necessarily think it's a goodbye to the sound. It's just kind of like
it's kind of our, I guess, feels almost like an update for like this kind of era of our new music or whatever. But I think it's, I mean, it initially was like, you know, we had that like drum beat, and we kind of like had
chords that are kind of just eighth noting or whatever.
Yeah, it was a very like simple demo at first, and then from there we just kind of started subtracting. Like I think over the course of writing our first album and also that single for Sub Pop, the Mono Retriever, like that song was, I would say that song feels more like the like
goodbye,
this send off to that kind of chapter of our sound. And then this song feels more like, more of an updated version, I would say.
Yeah. Because we definitely viewed the Sub Pop single as kind of like a bookend to the Mandatory Enjoyment era, and then the B-side with Pepsi Vacuum being kind of like what the possible future would be. And that song fits in with like the record. Yeah,
we were messing around with like sampling and more of like a droney electronic sound on that B-side, which we kind of wanted to go more in that direction for the album. So, but it took a long time to
get there,
to figure all that out, to really arrive there. Yeah.
Since you said it's an update to your sound, do you think that's why you chose it as one of your singles?
Yeah, I think it kind of just...
I think it emerged just in the recording process. We're like, oh, this is a single. It wasn't a song. Like, I think in the beginning of recording the record, we definitely had ideas of what the singles would be. And by the end, I think we had different ideas of what.
Yeah.
I think originally we were like Blue Dada is going to be the first single. And then, whatever kind of happened, beyond that. But then it ended up.
We had sent it to a lot of friends and everyone kind of picked out that song as like one of their favorites. And I mean, it makes sense because I feel like it did sort of hit on a more pop note than a lot of the other songs. So, and it's very catchy. I feel like Emma really killed it with like her
melody
and her hooks on the chorus. So yeah, we were stoked.
And what were some of the influences that you used for this album?
Well, I feel like the big ones would be Mark Van Hoen, which definitely really painted kind of like, in the midst of recording the record, his record, Morning View, under the Morning Light, not the Incubus album. Morning Light definitely influenced a lot of like ideas for the production and stuff like that. And then
early on, we were listening to we were really trying to kind of channel like Seafeel and
Bowery Electric.
Yeah, like kind of more of a trip hop sound.
And then for like me personally, it was more like Flying Nun bands and Too Pure bands and Cranky bands. Like all those labels really had a big influence on the writing.
And then I'd say the other side of it was like ambient music, like especially like 90s sort of like, I guess IDM adjacent like ambient music. That was just a big thing that I was listening to a lot of when we were working on this album.
Yeah, we really stayed away from any new age or krautrock or spiritual jazz from this record, opposed to like Mandatory, which was really informed by those things. And this one's definitely more informed by like pop music and then, shambolic indie rock and then the ambient electronic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then speaking of that, you guys created a playlist that's entitled 90s Ambient Rock. If you could describe that sound to the listener, what would you describe it as?
Well, I think we were trying to kind of trace this like thread of drone based music through a bunch of different scenes that were happening in the 90s, both in the US and in the UK, and even, do we have anything else from like everywhere else in the world? But it was a lot of like electronic, so it was a lot of electronic influenced like rock music. So a lot of, basically we're trying to find bands that sort of used rock instrumentation like drum, live drums and bass and guitar and everything, but to kind of achieve like an more electronic music sound, or like IDM or like ambient, like drone stuff.
Yeah, it's like it's the post, kind of like the the original post rock, which a lot of it, that's what a lot of the stuff on the playlist would have been considered at its time, was like more like post rock influence stuff, or not post rock influence. It's stuff that was called post rock, but because it was literally like, it felt like it was rock music, but it wasn't like rocking out music. It was more like internal and like atmospheric and less like I'm gonna rock kind of like stuff. And so the playlist definitely kind of traces the lines between drone stuff like Azusa Plain, Wendy and Carl, Roy Montgomery, to more like electronic leaning stuff like Seafeel and Bowery Electric and like Leica. And then there's some stuff like Moonshake, which definitely feels more like aggressive and rock oriented, but it's still not rock music, And I think a lot of like all the bands kind of rejected rockism and rock, they used rock instrumentation to create something more other like cosmic and otherworldly and drone centered and electronic, opposed to, I think at the time a lot of it was a reaction also to grunge being extremely popular. And that's, I think we relate to just going against the grain of like, rock and roll kind of tropes and the maleness of rock music. And we wanted our record to feel especially like more on the androgynous, feminine, like gay side of, I guess, because we're married, and then Emma. And I think there was just our earlier stuff didn't necessarily feel male centered, but it felt more dude-ish, and we wanted to make something that felt more, I don't know, I guess, yeah, feminine, androgynous, opposely, because that's what makes like a lot of the bands on the playlist and like stuff like shoegaze bands. It was the mixture of androgynous and the femme and the masculine all kind of swirling together, opposed to like one side taking over.
Yeah, I would say that like Emma's vocals are like more prominent on this album than previous ones. I mean, they're not here, but like speaking on their behalf, do you think that was like a role that they were happy to take?
Oh yeah. I feel like Emma really like took to the songs in a way that she hadn't previously. And then also in the past, we had definitely, as I was saying, like the tunnel vision of what I had, the idea of what a dummy thing should sound like. I think we were very in control of like how melodically she used her voice more so in the past. In this one, we were kind of like, just do whatever you want. And so I think that kind of freedom allowed her to express herself more thoroughly than she had in the past. And I think that's a huge reason why she's more prominent on this record. I think she was just really inspired by like the freedom of creativity that she didn't necessarily have in previous recordings, where we were giving very specific kind of like ideas and influences for her to kind of like internalize. This one, I think, was definitely more herself.
Mm-hmm. And then for the playlist, could you take us through some of your favorite songs off of it?
Oh yeah. Wait. I guess I'll look at the phone. For me, Transient Waves, the second track, that song Paradise is extremely beautiful and like far out. And that's a band that, in the midst of recording the record, Alex and I really got kind of deep into. And then I think, what else? I'm looking through I think a more recent thing that we found, Close Down Red Oval. That song is like really bonkers, sonically speaking, just the mixture of noise and the way the guitars sound, but there's also like this beautiful gentleness to it. So the kind of like, those two things meeting in the middle, it's really cool.
I would say for me, I was really into this Orang song, which is like a band that had members of Talk Talk.
Yeah, and Beth Gibbons sings on.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, like free, like very avant-garde influenced, like free, like jazz and free music. Like it's kind of like super dynamic. Like every song is like almost a different genre. But yeah, they were definitely in that kind of ambient avant-garde, like there's definitely a drone element sort of going through.
They were definitely associated with like Bark Psychosis, with another band from that era.
But yeah, and then also like this Slow Dive track from Pygmalion, like that album was a huge album that I've definitely been a huge fan of and listening to that album for like so many years. But I would say when we were working on this album in recent months, like just listening to this so much and getting really into the idea of like, more spacious music and more like open sounding music.
And and then the opening track Sugar Daddy by Laika is just like a really, I like their first record a lot because of how aggressive it is. It's not like aggressive in the like volume or like distortion, but like the break beats and the all the beats just feel like really fast and in your face, which a lot of times with music like this, it definitely can be pretty slow and like internal and kind of narcotic. And we aren't a slow or narcotic band at all. We definitely are like try to be up tempo and fun. And I think just like pulling from those different, the juxtaposition of like more ambient soundscapes, but then the rhythms are much more like propulsive and in your face, I think is really interesting. And they just, so much of their stuff is based fully on sampling, that they're just building these worlds that we haven't even like tried to do like sampling outside of our band. We just sample ourselves. And I think in the future that might be something we explore. It's just hard to say, like, it's just not something I've never listened to music in the sense of like plundering it for samples, but I think that could be fun to do. But it's hard to say if, how that will come into play later. But I definitely think the playlist in and of itself is kind of like, this record feels like we're just scratching the surface of like this new kind of way of approaching our songs. And I think the next one will be even further in the world of, the guitars sounding not like guitars and like the rhythms being influenced by like electronic music and, kind of pushing further away from rock music just in general, but without losing the kind of propulsion that we love about like rock music and whatever subgenre is connected to that.
I think on this playlist, I'm really drawn to Distractions by Insects.
Yeah.
I think it's like a really lovely track. And I can see what you're saying, how using your instruments to kind of try and like, not like mellow them out, but like make them into something different. I think a couple of bands that I talked to recently have been trying to like use sounds and instruments to kind of make it sound like a memory of sorts instead of like a traditional sound that like you can put into a particular genre.
For sure. Yeah. That's the hardest thing about like with guitars, at least, it's expressing the thing that is in your mind and in your body through like this kind of limited, 12 notes. And, you just there, I think like it's hard because for us, we've heard just so much music in our lives and our taste goes from like, wildly different directions. And I think for us, it's harder and harder to find sounds that feel exciting to us because, immediately when we're writing songs or like a melody or something, if it sounds like something else we recognize, we're usually like quick to be like, nope, get rid of it. Like we try to find sounds that we haven't heard like a million times over. And I think that's harder and harder to do, especially with rock instruments. I think with electronic music and like hip hop, it's easier to kind of create these more interesting sound palettes because it's newer opposed to like rock and roll that's like been around since, the late 50s. And so for us, it's just, constantly trying to find new ways to use rock instruments to make it more interesting sounds. And I think like, the playlist is like a reflection of that, of like, bands that in my mind are even still ahead of their time in a lot of ways. Like I think Transient Waves is like ahead of their time. I think Sea Fuel is definitely ahead of their time. And there's other stuff that like AMP and Third Eye Foundation, and that there's definitely more of an aggressive quality to it that, still has like, there's still like a pop catchiness somewhere in there, but it's like wrapped around this like caustic noise that like, and the same with like Flying Saucer Attack and stuff like that. So I think just kind of like figuring out how to balance all those things with rock instruments and not, not kind of go the way that I feel like a lot of more experimental bands now go, which is like using overuse of computers and backing tracks and stuff like that, and not really focus, I don't know, digging into like, I don't know, I think it's easier to make, rock music in theory sound more interesting when you just kind of pile some like computer stuff on top of it. But I think it's more interesting to us to find that within, using the instruments. I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling in a way that doesn't make sense, but I don't know. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts, Alex?
Am I rambling?
I mean, I think it's hard to break out of like any instrument can feel like a box, like anytime you pick up a guitar, like your fingers kind of go to the same chords. Like it's just kind of like, it's easy to feel like it's limiting. And I think that's why like a lot, pretty much all like, modern day, like experimental music is like electronic music, or like, there's like fringe hip hop stuff that's like, very much avant-garde influence. But with rock music, it feels so stuck in the past a lot of the times, I would say. And I think it's definitely hard. Like the longer the time goes on and like sort of the history of music gets more and more rich, like it also becomes harder and harder to just like come up with a new idea, because so much territory has already been tread. So,
and I think also the current landscape of music kind of incentivizes making music that is easy to put in boxes.
Yeah, like get categorized with other things. Like if you're like this kind of band, you have to have this sound that will fit in with like this other stuff that people already like or whatever. Like I think for us, we don't really feel like there's a lot of other bands who sound anything like us, or it's hard to compare us to other modern bands, I would say. And so
we just don't relate on like a band to band level with very many bands. There's like, there's a band like JRCG who I think for us is kind of comparable, even though they're definitely darker than us. I think like, they're folding in a lot of like rhythmic ideas and a lot of like using texture and sound and sampling in a way that's interesting, that they're coming at it from a different angle, but it's a similar kind of like, trying to make music that feels like celebratory and like live and like feeling alive. And I think for us, a lot of other bands, definitely feel more stuck. Like it's like, here's your shoegaze band, and here's your post-punk band, and here's your indie rock band, and here's your slowcore band. And like for us, we can play with like any kind of band because we kind of cover a lot of territory, whether it's playing with like Luna or playing with Botch. Those bands couldn't be further apart from each other, but we kind of can play with those sort of bands. And I feel like for us, we want to be as like sonically diverse as possible. And I think, for us, we pull from like hip hop and like, but we also pull from like, noise pop music, or from trip hop or electronic or IDM, or just a lot of different stuff. And I think a lot of bands, tend to stay in a lane, and we're not interested in that at all. We just kind of like do exactly our own thing.
Yeah, I think it is harder with instruments because it's just kind of like reinventing the wheel in a way, because it's hard to do something different when you can like just come back to something that's already done something similar.
Yeah, I think most people want to like, when they're writing music, it's for fun, or it's for, some sort of like emotional expression, and that's fine, obviously. But for us, it's like we're trying to push past those kind of initial things and dig in as hard as we can into like the artistic side of making music. It's not, we're not really trying to like, appeal to anyone but ourselves. You know, we want, if we're excited about it, that's all we really care about.
It's awesome. And so we're coming towards the end of the interview. Is there anything that y'all want to plug? Obviously, the album comes out September 6th, but anything else?
Our tour, which is going to be in September.
Yeah, our West Coast tour, where we're hitting all the, you know, the cities you would expect. And
we have a big release show here in LA at Lodge Room
on September 7th with an incredibly stacked lineup of a very diverse bill of bands. Corridor, who makes like really interesting kind of like crowd infused, I don't know, weird guitar music. And then Time Warp, who makes minimalist composer kind of electronic ambient music. Blimp, who's, in my opinion, one of the most exciting kind of noise rock bands here in LA. And then Lockslip, who is equally one of the most exciting kind of like chaotic hardcore metalcore bands to come out in recent memory. And then, yeah, I don't know, like listen to Modati. I don't know. Listen to Motors.
Yeah. I also love Blimp too. They opened for Millie a while back.
Oh, cool. Are you LA based?
No, I'm New York based currently.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Was Blimp in New York with Millie?
No, they weren't in New York. When Millie had their record release show, I think it was Chatterton and Blimp that were in the bill, if I'm not mistaken.
Cool. That's dope. Yeah, Blimp rules. They're really good live, but they definitely have some like little pop moments that I think they could definitely lean into, and it could be really cool and exciting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for taking time out of your day to come on the pod.
We really appreciate you having us.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
It was really fun to make the playlist. We're into doing that.
I'm glad to hear. Yeah. All right. Thank you guys so much. And
yeah, take care.